Alrighty, if people coming in right now can grab a seat. So we started. Are there, Marius, are there any other announcements or no? Social dinner reminders? No? Okay. Alrighty. So this is the last session of the day. And just as a reminder, we start back up tomorrow promptly at 9, so go enjoy yourselves this evening, but be back in the morning. But before that, we have our final talk of the day, Anjon Chatterjee from the University of Pennsylvania, some thoughts on embodiment and abstraction.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, maybe too loud. That's okay. On there. So it's a great pleasure to be here. In part, I titled this in anticipation of Alfonso's comment, which is going to happen at the end. So let me make it beforehand, which is, we don't know what we mean by thought. We don't know what we mean by embodiment. We don't know what we mean by abstraction. Some is probably hard. So keeping those questions in mind, I thought I'd start. And start by at least recognizing the fact that a lot of this meeting is about how we think with respect to our relationship to the world, how we think internally. And arguably, one of the dominant notions in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience right now is that a lot of our thinking is embodied. And what do we mean by embodied? At least some version of embodiment is that when we think of concepts, the way we understand things is a simulation of our previous encounters with something that had to do with that concept. And other versions of embodiment, at least when one thinks about this as a neuroscientist, might be the extent to which instantiation or implementation of certain ideas and concepts engage sensory motor cortices. That becomes a kind of operational way in which people talk about embodiment. Whether or not that kind of activation of sensory motor cortices is necessary or a modifier, there are all sorts of questions about that, but that becomes kind of a notion of embodiment as gets cashed out in many neuroscience studies. And if one accepts this as a basic starting point, the kind of obvious question that comes up is, how do we abstract? Right? If everything is embedded within sensory motor systems, what does abstraction even mean? And how does one get to abstraction? And we talked about this a little bit in the first talk this morning, and I think some of these themes I'll return to. And what I'd like to do is take a very traditional approach. And by traditional, I mean a traditional approach from neurology. And we can go back more than 100 years to questions of how people understand objects. And you go back to Lissauer, and he was quite clear that there are different ways in which people might not know objects. And so what he referred to as an apperceptive agnosia was problems recognizing objects that was primarily driven by the way our visual system seems to be impaired. And what is shown here is an example of a person with an apperceptive agnosia who is an artist who's trying to copy various sorts of objects, and you can see, despite being a person who is skilled in graphic display, is unable to do very well copying objects. And this is contrasted with what Lissauer referred to as an associative agnosia. And this is another clinical example of a patient who, in retrospect, it was published in 1992, probably had a semantic dementia, but semantic dementia wasn't a diagnosis in the early 90s that we knew about. And what is shown here is his ability to copy drawings very exquisitely, but if asked to draw something from a word, so he's given lexical information and he has to draw something like a comb or a desk, and his drawings are really very, very sort of primitive as compared to his ability to render graphic images from when he takes a visual representation and reproduces it. And so this idea that we can have knowledge or information that's along a continuum for things that are very sensory or closer to sensory information and things that have more to do with our conceptual representation of objects is an idea that has been around for over 100 years. And if you think about the motor system, again, when you go back to this time, you can think about work that Lippmann did, talking about apraxias, and on the motor end of it, you think of people that have limb kinetic apraxias or idiomotor apraxias that really have to do with the kind of spatial and temporal timing of skilled movements, as contrasted with people who have what is sometimes referred to as ideational apraxia or conceptual apraxia. And so the general point being that we can think of a continuum of representations from concrete to abstract, and I would like to suggest this is a very old and traditional way of looking at things. And in some ways, the emphasis, I think, on embodied views of cognition has sort of collapsed this distinction. And I'd like to expand it again, at least for conversation here. And so one way one might do this is talk about a continuum, or a gradient, or whatever word we want to use, going from concrete to abstract. And on the one hand, you might say there are certain pictorial things that represent tokens, all the way up to words or symbols, and then even words that might, or propositions that might make reference to concrete things in the world versus propositions that make references to more abstract things. And so this is one way of thinking about this continuum. And I would argue that the lower down at the concrete end, fidelity becomes very important. So the kinds of things that Rich and Uda were talking about, fidelity is important. If you're reaching for something, or you're trying to decide whether something, a sound and a visual object is the same, fidelity is really important. But the higher up you go along this, flexibility becomes important, generativity becomes important, and fidelity less so. And this is the realm of alternative facts, right? Because there's a lot more slop in the system when you get there. Okay, so what I'd like to focus a little bit on is this central piece that's called schemas. And I'd like to at least state the problem in a way that someone much, much smarter than me articulated, which is Kant. So he says, there must be some third thing, which on the one side is homogeneous with the category, and with the phenomena on the other, and so makes the application of the former to the latter possible. This mediating representation must be pure, and pure meaning without any direct empirical content, and yet must on the one side be intellectual, and on the other side sensuous. And he refers to this as a transcendental schema. And so I've adopted that term. The cognitive linguist Talmy, for example, also uses the term schema. Schema gets used in a variety of ways, but for this purpose, these are at least the roots for why I'm using that term. And Kant goes on to say, this is hidden in the depths of the human soul, whose true modes of action we can only with difficulty discover and unveil. The image is a product of the empirical faculty. It's of sensuous conception, and is a product, as it were, a monogram of pure imagination a priori. So it has this intermediate sort of quality between, I would argue, sort of where perception and action is, and on the other hand, where conception is. And so one way to cash this out that we thought is to talk about very pared down iconic images. And so with these kinds of images, where you can have stick figures, where you immediately know that that figure in there, most people seem to recognize that that's a representation of push, even though it doesn't have a lot of the properties, the sensuous properties that you would see. So it's not empirical in that sense, as well as spatial relations, where you know that in this case the square is above the circle, and which on the one hand is related to the proposition above, and is also related to the fact that in the world we see many things in a certain kind of spatial relationship, and we have a sense of that. And I would also like to suggest these kinds of schematic representations are all around us. And here are some examples. So you think of the icons that are used in the Olympics. These are basically describing a variety of actions. It has the advantage that it is easily understood. It doesn't have the same kind of variability that words have, that you have to know the language to know what those words are referring to. Road signs often, there's a way in which if you're driving at 60 or 70 miles an hour, you want to have that information quickly, right? So there's an efficiency of communication. And it's somewhat surprising to me, at least in neurology, neuroscience, maybe cognitive science, these as a form have never really been studied very much. And I'd be curious for the developmental folks if there has been much work done for this kind of representation. But it turns out once you start looking for it, something along this line shows up all over the place and shows up in various creative ways. For example, this is from Isaac Newton when he was trying to work out what he thought about gravity. And he tended to do these kinds of doodles. And there are probably many people in here, when you're trying to work out ideas, we draw these kinds of schematic diagrams as a way to organize our information. And the question is there a kind of alphabet of this that then gets concatenated in different ways? And so at a first pass, what I'd like to investigate is, do these kinds of representations have any kind of neural reality, in the sense that the brain is sensitive to these kinds of representations that are distinct from, say, words or images, pictures? So this is one study that we did, which was looking at actions, and it was designed to ask a question about generalization across different kinds of action formats. But for this purpose, the data I'd like to show you are a direct contrast. This is an fMRI study, a direct contrast between when people are looking at pictures of actions versus the schematic drawings of actions. And what we end up finding in a direct contrast is, as you can imagine, that the pictures are much more sensorially rich, and so a lot of visual cortex is activated for pictures over these schematic drawings. But there are two areas, again in this univariate contrast, there are two areas that seem to be disproportionately reactive within the brain to these schematic representations. And one is within the left posterior middle temporal gyrus. And for people here who study action observations, this would probably not come as a surprise. It might come as a surprise that you have more activation for these schematic representations than pictures of drawings. And we have a kind of story to be told about maybe there might be a kind of gradient of abstraction along the posterior middle temporal gyrus, but I'm not going to talk about that here now. But then the other place that seems to be active for these schematic representations is something we spent a fair amount of time talking about in Uda's talk, which is within the right intraparietal sulcus going into the supramarginal gyrus again. And to sort of, you suggested that this might have something to do with prioritizing prioritizing spatial information. And maybe that's a reasonable characterization of prioritizing what's important, in the sense that there's a lot of information in the picture, like the color of what people are wearing, whether they're skinny or not. This is just not relevant, and so it might be it's prioritizing and distilling what's really important for understanding, just in a very basic way, this kind of action. Yes?
What was the task?
In this task, they were doing a same different kind of task, and that was really the main point of the paper was to ask a question of generalization across different formats, right? But this was a side analysis because we were interested in this. So this at least suggests that there are parts of the brain that are more sensitive to these kinds of representations, even though they're less sensorially rich. So now the next thing I'm going to talk about is these kinds of spatial relations, and this is a patient study. And so this is a study in which we took, these are people, adults that have had strokes. This chronic stroke, so they're at least 6 months out from their stroke, where to the extent that they will have recovery tends to be quite asymptotic after that. And this is a task in which they are making these kinds of spatial judgments, which is they're looking at a picture and saying, are these two other pictures in the same spatial relationship? They match the preposition to these pictures, and then we also have these schematic representations where they have to judge whether the picture or the word, which of these schematic representations matches those things. And so across the board, what we find is, in general, people with left brain damage do worse than people with right brain damage. And it doesn't matter if there are words involved, right? So even if they're purely pictorial stimuli, people with left brain damage tend to do worse. And this might have something to do with Steve Koslin's old idea that in this case, the pictures are in a categorical relation. We're not asking a metric kind of question. And it turns out that as a group, people with left brain damage are not as adept at this as people with right brain damage. It is also the case that people do worse with these kinds of schematic representations. It's a little strange task for people that have never looked at this. These are older people with stroke. And it is also the case across the entire group. In this case, we had 34 patients, 17 left, 17 right brain damaged people. It is also the case that in general, performance correlates. If they're bad on one of these tasks, they're also not as good on the other tasks. So performance correlates. So then we did something. This is a Vlsm analysis, which is looking at what kinds of voxels, when they're damaged, is predictive of behavior, but something very specific, which is we looked at a kind of using residuals as the dependent measure in this. And so the logic is that if someone has a hard time with prepositions and they have a hard time with schemas, is it the case that there are some people that have a disproportionately greater difficulty with schemas than they do with words or pictures? So that's the kind of logic behind this, right? So it's disproportionate problems with some kind of format. And what you see on the top is that if you ask the question, do people have more trouble with prepositions as compared to any of these other kinds of formats, you get left hemisphere predominant damage. Mostly in parts of inferior frontal gyrus and parts of superior temporal gyrus. And we have other data that replicates this in other forms. If you ask the question of do they have problems with these pictures that are depicting spatial relationships out of proportion to other formats, you get, again, right hemisphere. So this general idea of verbal and pictorial having some distinction between right and left seems to play out. In this case, you get right middle frontal gyrus and a little bit of inferior frontal gyrus. And then the question of schemas, which is what we're most interested in. And it turns out, again, that when people have right intraparietal sulcus, parts of supramarginal gyrus damage, that they have disproportionate problems with schemas in this case as compared to the other kinds of formats. And it's a bit curious because here is a completely different method, right? It's patients, not fMRI. It's using now spatial relationships rather than actions. And maybe this is a coincidence, but at least it gives you the sense that maybe among the many things the intraparietal sulcus does, maybe it is having to do, it does something about extracting these basic forms. And so then we did another case study. This is an individual case. And this is someone who had biparietal damage, more posterior and ventral than the intraparietal sulcus. This person has a syndrome that is sometimes referred to as Balint syndrome, which has a classic triad, which is people have a hard time voluntarily moving their eyes. They have an optic ataxia, which is they have problems with visually guided reaching. And for our purposes, they often also have something referred to as simultaneous agnosia, which means they can't see more than one thing at a time. And so we thought this would be an interesting, potentially informative case in which to look at these kinds of representations. And what's being shown here in this little star figure under the person's MRI is that if she was shown the kind of pinkish star figure, she has no trouble seeing the star figure. If she's shown the one to the right of it, she only sees the green oval and not the other forms, right? So it's a kind of bedside test that people sometimes use to assess for this. And so we gave her the same kind of task, and what we find is that she actually does better when given schematic representations, when she has to judge these kinds of spatial relations, and worse when she's given fully articulated pictures. And even though this in some ways is a more abstract task, in many of our cases patients tend to find it a little odd, she actually does much better. And when she's given pictures, often she's a chance. She can't really tell what's going on. So again, suggestive at least that there is something specific about these kinds of schematic representations where when you have a certain kind of damage, someone can have simultaneous agnosia. But in this case, because the information is pared down, we think she actually does quite well when information is presented in such a way. Perhaps consistent with this notion that there is something about the efficiency of communication with these kinds of schematic representations. So the next thing is some data that we're in the process of analyzing right now. And it's a different kind of schematic representations, which are arrows that might give you sort of a spatial direction. And so here we have images that might show how a road turns, and schematic representations of that, and words, which is its right or left, so on and so forth. And the reason for the background in both the schematic and word representations is it's a way to sort of to match low-level background information across all three kinds of images. So just a behavioral test to ask this question: are schematic representations a more efficient way of communicating information? And so this is simply a behavioral task where people are just saying, is it the same or different? And what we essentially find is that across the board, when the image in front of a person is a schematic representation, they're faster than if it's a picture or it's a word. And then if you look across that, it is the case that there is a same format advantage. So when people have pictures and they're looking at a picture, they're slightly faster. When people are looking at words and the next item is a word, they're slightly faster than the others. But across the board, schematic representations tend to be faster. Schemas to schemas are faster. And it looks like they might have a kind of intermediate status when people are switching formats. So an imaging experiment that we've done, and literally, I mean, the data was just finished being collected a couple of weeks ago. And so we haven't done all of the analyses, but for this purpose, I wanted Steve, my postdoc, to do one specific analysis, so to see if I had anything to show you around this. And again, the question being, is there some is there something about these kinds of schematic representations that have that parts of the brain, whatever parts they are, I don't have a commitment to IPS at this point, it's too early, but is there any part of the brain that has some kind of privileged response to these sorts of representations? It looks like if we look at IPS, it's able to decode across all of these formats. So IPS is still doing something interesting with these kinds of directional spatial representations. But the more specific question is between schemas and words. And what this is an RSA searchlight. And what we find is that there is an area, which I think, I defer to Alex on this, but I think this is probably the visual word form area over here, which seems to have a privileged response to words, whereas the correlation between words and words is significantly greater than they are between words and schemas. And then just adjacent to it, there does seem to be an area that has the same kind of property with schemas, where the correlation between the similarity matrix between schemas and other schemas are greater than they are between schemas and words, right? So there seems to be something about these kinds of schematic representations, which you can say are similar to letters, right? They're simple graphemes that seem to communicate some kind of information that seem to be adjacent to what many people think is the visual word form area. And so to then step back a little bit, to go back to the idea that this has not been studied very much in most domains that I'm aware of, and yet informally, there are plenty of examples of how people use this to organize their thinking and to extend their thinking. And here are some rather well-known examples. The top left is Edison, when he was trying to figure out how to figure out some pipes in a factory that he was working on, where for the exhaust system, so it's these kinds of drawings. Underneath that is a quick sketch by Frank Gehry when he was trying to think of a building that he was going to design. Below that is Bell when he was trying to communicate what a telephone might actually be. On the top right is Darwin from his notebooks, where he even starts out, says, I think, and then instead of continuing to write, he starts doing these sorts of sketches. And underneath that is from Einstein's notebooks, where he's preparing for a class. And so at least it seems to be phenomenologically that a lot of people use these kinds of very pared down representations to organize their thinking in a way to communicate that is not done as easily with words. At least what we're suggesting is these little bits that we're getting at, which is schematic representations, pared down of actions, spatial relations, directions. There might be a kind of a vocabulary of these things that then get concatenated in ways that people use in more creative ways. So the second part of this talk I'd like to get to is talking about symbols and metaphors. And here, at least the notion of abstraction is that we're dealing with linguistic material, so they're abstract at some level to begin with, but the linguistic material can make reference to concrete things or can make reference to abstract things, particularly by making use of figurative uses of language. And so what do we know about the neural systems involved in that? So when we first started looking at this about 10 years ago, the dominant view was that metaphor and the instantiation of metaphor comprehension was a right hemisphere function. And generally there's these kinds of divisions that people tend to make, which is, it's very clear the left hemisphere is important for literal language, for certain aspects of syntax, for phonology, various aspects of semantics. And it had been known for some time that the right hemisphere is not bereft of any kind of communicative function. Certainly prosody, when people communicate emotional prosody, the way you understand if someone is angry or happy or sad or surprised, that seems to be information that is communicated through the right hemisphere. Some people have thought that pragmatics at a larger scale, for example, rather the sentential, but at the paragraph and the narrative level, perhaps the right hemisphere has something important to say. And there are some questions of how much semantics is done by the right hemisphere as well. But in the 80s, there were a series of studies that suggested that the right hemisphere perhaps was also especially vulnerable to comprehending metaphor when brain damaged. And this idea was given a boost by Mark Beeman's notion of coarse coding. And what he did was, I think he sort of extended an earlier idea that Rich Ivory and Lynn Robertson had about differences in how the right hemisphere and left hemisphere filtered visual information. And the idea was that the left hemisphere had a tighter, Rich, correct me if I get this wrong, but had a tighter focus did more high frequency kind of visual information, and the right hemisphere had a coarser, a lower frequency filter for visual information. And what Mark suggested was maybe that was a more generalizable principle and also applied for semantic systems. And so it might be the case if you have a metaphor that says X is Y, that normally we might take both those things, for whatever reason, the metaphors that get used in papers that to reference this is either, it's one of two things, either the lawyer is a shark, which we can think about why that one is so salient, but even worse is, which my postdocs seem to always use, is my job is a jail, right? Which is problematic. But the general idea being that, okay, you've got lawyer and you've got shark, and if you have a very narrow focus of your semantic system, those are really kept quite different. But if you have a coarser sense of it, you start to see where there's overlap across these kinds of, these semantic systems. There might be associations with being a predator, being dangerous, so on and so forth. And so that was a very appealing idea and was supported by some of the early work and kind of became the received wisdom in, I would say, going into past the 90s into the early aughts. And when we started looking at this literature, there were certain things that for us felt problematic, which is, I mean, we didn't have any commitment one way or the other, but it seemed as though that a lot of the stimuli had visual confounds. So it might be, you know, he has a heavy heart, and one of the choices would be someone sort of, you know, walking with this heavy heart in front of them. The other was they often used few stimuli. Often there were mixed metaphor types, so they might be nominal metaphors, or they might be predicate metaphors, or they might be adjectives used metaphorically. And if we think that, for example, nouns and verbs have different neural instantiations, there's no reason to think, a priori, one would expect that the figurative use of those terms might also have different neural instantiations, so that seemed like a confound. There were relatively poor control conditions. And then this one was especially interesting to me, which is that they seem to have mixed degrees of familiarity, which is that some things that were, metaphors that were highly familiar would often get mixed in with things that were less familiar. And to talk about how or why this might be a problem, again, to quote from someone who articulates this much better than I could. This is Emerson. He says, "The etymologist finds the deadest words to have once been a brilliant picture. Language is fossil poetry." I love that, fossil poetry. "As the limestone of the continent consists of infinite masses of the shells of animalcules, so language is made up of images or tropes which now in their secondary use have long ceased to remind us of their poetic origin." And so this is an example of saying that a metaphor is not a metaphor is not a metaphor. That there are ways in which when metaphors become conventionalized, become familiar, they eventually also become dead metaphors. And if all of those are intermixed and confounded, you don't really know what it is you're looking at. And so what we decided to do was we had to start from scratch and come up with novel metaphors, which is what we spent a lot of time doing. And so now we have two publications, one from 2010 and one from last year, where we came up with novel metaphors, spent a lot of time matching them to literal sentences, norming them on a variety of psycholinguistic measures. So for the major lexical items on frequency, concreteness, length, We normed them at the sentence level for how familiar or natural they seemed to people, how figurative they were, whether they were easily interpreted. And the valence ratio was just a way for us to see on a reaction time measure how disproportionately difficult were they to interpret one way or the other. So it's just a kind of, and so by now between these two studies we have published 800 sentences, 400 metaphors and 400 literal ones, and so that they're available for people to use, at least if your population are people who speak American English. I don't know how it would generalize to other places. And we also, so they're also divided whether they're nominal metaphors or predicate metaphors, and if they're nominal metaphors, if they're a nominal entity metaphor or a nominal event metaphor. So you can start to ask questions about sort of the syntax of the sentence, as opposed to whether that makes a difference. You can ask your question even if it's within the noun, if the noun is referring to an object, or whether it's referring to an event. So you can ask whether it's the semantics of that. And then we also paid some attention to the base term or the vehicle term, whether most of the information was being carried through auditory or visual information. So you could ask, you potentially can ask questions based on whether you think the information that is being used figuratively is conveyed through an auditory. For example, that idea was like a clap of thunder, right? So that's an auditory kind of metaphor. Okay, so the imaging experiment we did was wanting to ask this question of is it the case that the right hemisphere is dominant for metaphor processing? And embedded in that was a secondary question. It was that as metaphors become more conventionalized, might it be the case that when they're novel, that the right hemisphere is engaged, and as they get conventionalized, the neural activity might shift to the left hemisphere, right? Seems like a fairly straightforward prediction from at least our reading of the literature, and people had suggested that maybe novelty is the critical thing for the right hemisphere and so on and so forth. But that is not what we found. And so just to give you a sense of the way we did this is, since we had a set of novel metaphors, we could train our participants before they went in the scanner, which is we could select certain metaphors where they did several tasks on, some of the same norming tasks, so that they had to process this at a semantic level, versus, so in one case they did 5 of the tasks, in one case they did 2, and in the other case they saw them de novo. Right, so we had control over, at least within this little artificial paradigm, how conventionalized it was for each person, how each individual metaphoric proposition was conventionalized for each person, and of course those were counterbalanced so that the ones that were novel for subjects varied across the participants. And what we end up finding was it is not the case that the neural activity shifts from one hemisphere to another as metaphors become more conventionalized. What seems to happen is that within parts of bilaterally of inferior frontal gyrus and left posterior middle temporal gyrus, that the neural activity, if anything, just gets sharper as the metaphors are experienced as more conventionalized. So it's almost like an expertise model, right? There are plenty of studies that show as people develop expertise, the neural responsiveness of the brain for that particular task tends to be sharper and sharper. And that's what it seems like what's going on, is that there isn't a shift across regions. It's just the tuning. It's as though it's a tuning model that these parts of the brain that are responding to metaphors tend to be better tuned. Okay, but we still have, the right hemisphere still seems to be involved with this, with these kinds of, at least in this task of responding to metaphors. And so now I'm going to talk about 2 patient studies that are not published, which is that we're collecting, we're in the process of analyzing all their data. And so one is this disorder that is called logopenic primary progressive aphasia. So some of you may know that there are these degenerative conditions It's broadly under the category of frontotemporal dementias. So Alzheimer's is by far the most common. There are frontotemporal dementias. Within that, there are a couple that disproportionately have problems in language. And it turns out this particular kind of linguistic problem fairly consistently has shown that there is regional atrophy within the left perisylvian cortex. And it also turns out in this particular descriptive variant, almost always the pathology is the same pathology as you see in typical Alzheimer's disease. So amyloid plaques and tangles, except instead of, for reasons nobody really understands, instead of being distributed in the way that it typically is, which is starting in medial temporal cortex, it starts in perisylvian cortex. We have no idea why, but the phenomena is quite well understood. And so we gave 8 patients this kind of metaphor comprehension task where they're choosing between different possible interpretations. And the way we set this up is that there is the foils could be related to the literal sentence, the non-figurative sense of the vehicle. It could be the opposite of the metaphoric sentence, or it could be a completely unrelated term. And what we find is that the patient group does worse across these language tasks, which is no surprise because they, by definition, have a language deficit. But it turns out that they do disproportionately more poorly with metaphors. And then we take all 8 participants and look at them as a series of single case analyses. And what we find is that there are a couple of patients that, at least on these kinds of tasks, do quite well. There's one who is terrible at both literal and metaphoric tasks. But there is this group in between, these 5 patients, where they very clearly have a single dissociation, where in some cases, they're normal on the literal sentences and have trouble with metaphoric sentences, despite the fact that these are quite well matched on psycholinguistic variables. Okay? So suggesting that it is possible to have a selective deficit in comprehending metaphor as compared to literal sentences, even when one goes through considerable pains to match the quality of the literal sentences. All right, so and then the last study I'd like to tell you about, which we're also analyzing right now, again, is a patient study. And this is where we have 20 healthy controls, 20 people with left brain damage and 20 people with right brain damage. One thing that what is being shown there is the performance of the healthy controls. And you can see that they're a little worse on the metaphors. But one thing that's sort of interesting is that people are better at predicate metaphors than they are at the nominal kinds, and particularly nominal entities are what's more problematic. And it's a curious thing, because if you just look at naming of actions and objects, or people's ability to identify nouns and verbs, in general, across many patient studies and across behavioral studies, it looks like people have more trouble naming actions than objects, coming up with verbs than nouns. But in this case, there's something about predicate metaphors that seem to be less sensitive than nominal, particularly nominal entity metaphors. So nominal event metaphors are somewhere in between. So when we look at patients, that same pattern is recapitulated, going from worse at nominal entity, then nominal event, then predicate metaphors. And again, what we see as a group, the people with left brain damage tend to be worse than the group of people with right brain damage. And what's being shown at the bottom is the difference between their ability to do literal sentences versus metaphoric sentences. And so again, you can see the left brain damaged people have really much more of a problem with metaphor than literal sentences, and it goes down to where the predicate ones, it's not so clear, at least as a group, that these are even abnormal. And so then we did, again, looked at all of these patients as single case studies to look at are there specific patterns. And we used a rather stringent, as stringent a way as we could think of to look at this. And we used, some of you may know, Crawford, who's done a lot of work on the kinds of statistics one can use in neuropsychology at a single case level. And we used some of his methods. And basically what we are showing here, these are single case statistics where the patients who have a metaphor deficit as compared to the normal controls on an individual basis. And then if they have a metaphor deficit, it's compared to their ability to do literal sentences. So those have to be statistically different as well. And we correct for multiple comparisons for the group that have metaphor deficits, and we correct for education. It turns out in our normal studies, education is a variable that has some, that accounts for some variance in how people do these tasks. And so we do all of this to get what we think are as stringent as we know how to identify people. And what we find is that of the 20 lefts, there are 4 patients who have a selective metaphor deficit, which is they have problems with comprehension metaphors, they do normally with literal sentences, and that difference is significant within the subject as well as compared to normal controls. Controlled for multiple comparisons, right? So 4 of the 20 have that. And there are 2 patients, one with left and one with right, that have what we're calling a general language deficit, which is they have problems with metaphors, but they also have problems with literal sentences. So we can't make any claims about the selectivity of their deficit. So, but it turns out that 4 of 20, now keep in mind, these are people that are over 6 months out. In many cases, they're working, right? These are people out there that have ostensibly recovered. If you give them aphasia batteries, they do very well. On the WOB, they're fine. Maybe you might catch a bit of an anomia here and there, right? But something on the order of 20 to 25% of chronic patients with left brain damage have these kinds of problems. It's something we've never really had a handle on or even assessed. And this is showing where their lesions were, and I have no clue what this means, right? There's nothing consistent. The behavior is clear, but in terms of the lesions, why 2 of these have medial frontal damage, I don't have a clue whether it has something to do with the way things, in such a flexible system, the way things organize and what their underlying white matter pathology is, I have no idea, but nonetheless. So the behavior is clear, the anatomy is not at all in this population. And then, you know, when you talk to some of these patients, because we're trying to get a sense of what's the phenomenology of these people that are actually out there working, and you get these kinds of comments that in conversation, sometimes I know there are things I'm not understanding, but I learn to go along. I smile and nod, right? And this one says, I used to read the newspaper every day, I don't anymore, it's too hard. Right? These are people who are performing normal on clinical aphasia batteries, right? So anyway, so that's the end of those data, and I would like to sort of acknowledge a number of postdocs over the last decade or so that have worked on various aspects of this, and at least try to shift the basic question of is cognition, is thinking embodied or not, to asking the question is what is it good for, right? What are these different representations good for? And you might say that the very sensory motor stuff are good for, in terms of fidelity, for acting in the world, right? So when I reach for this glass of water, I need to know exactly where it is. I need to have a visual representation of that and a motor representation that matches with that, right? There's no room for a slop in that. On the other hand, you could say these more schematic representations help organize people's thinking. If you actually put them out there, it offsets a kind of working memory, so you can start concatenating them. And you know, with metaphors, they're often thought of as one way to use to be able to think creatively, to take new situations and recast them in creative ways using old information. And there probably is a way in which it expands our mental toolkit. So that's all I have. Thanks. Oh, right, back.
Hello. I'm just wondering, so when you say image schema, it seems like could be many ways to depict a pared down version of something like an action or an event or a spatial relationship. For example, pushing, you had a stick figure with a car, but you could also imagine displaying it sort of with simple Michauan displays of like one object moving another along. So what is your thought on like the relationship between an image schema as it's depicted in the real world versus something that might be the way that a schema is represented in the mind?
Yeah. It's a good question, and I get asked some version of that question with some. And at this point, all I'm committed to is the idea that there is a lot of sensory information that's unimportant for the concept of interest, right? So the fact that you're sitting there, and if I'm thinking that you're sitting there, the fact that you have a striped shirt on is irrelevant to that notion, or that you wear glasses is irrelevant to that notion, right? So there's a lot of sensory information that's coming in that's irrelevant, and as long as much of that is pared away, right? And I don't know that I want to say there are clear-cut category boundaries between something being schematic and something being not, but the general principle being you shed as much of the sensory information, you make it as simple as possible, but not too simple, where it loses what it's trying to represent. And so the Michaud kind of stimuli where you can have one ball pushing another, right? That's a kind of pushing. It's a dynamic version of that. And I would be fine if you wanted to call that a schema.
Just to follow up on this comment about the schemas, and maybe I missed some of your examples, but most of them, they had some, I would say not action, but some dynamic information, either because they refer to actions or because it's a dynamic of thought, like when you organize your thoughts. And so I was wondering if your results and about schemas are specific to this dynamic dimension, or if they would apply to other schematic representation. For example, I don't remember if you showed a schematic representation of objects without you still have dynamic dimension with the different parts, but maybe to a lower extent. So.
Yeah, so there's this idea for object recognition, and Gian idea, right? One could argue that that's a kind of schematic idea of objects. We did show static ones, which is about spatial relations. So prepositional relations, on, over, under, in, and those are static, right? There's nothing that's not moving.
Yes, it's not moving, but I don't know if it conveys some dynamic information a little more than a single object. I don't know, it's just an open question. I don't know if you would
So
have
it conveys more information. Object. So there are some taxonomies that I've written about is you can actually do a 2x2, talk about static, dynamic, and a kind of intrinsic relationship or an extrinsic relationship, right? So these are definitely extrinsic in the sense that you have one object in relation to another. There's sometimes people talk about it as a figure-ground relation. And we've also looked at, not in this series of studies, we've looked at dynamic spatial relations. So another important notion in this world is the difference between manner of motion and path of motion. And we can show that those dissociate in how the brain organizes it. So that's a kind of dynamic spatial relation as compared to what in these experiments we've done, which I think one would argue are static. Now there's an added difference there, which is if you look at what is referred to as topologic versus projective spatial relations, right? So topologic are things like in, on, right? So there are things, they're closely aligned, maybe contact is the important feature, versus projective, which is above or beyond or below, right? So it's projected, that people typically have more trouble with projective spatial relations than topologic ones, that those are more vulnerable to disruption.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm a little surprised actually, Anjon, that you still think your data support an underlying deficit in metaphorical process, a single underlying deficit in metaphorical processing, or perhaps I'm overinterpreting. Certainly after you showed all of those very disparate lesions leading to an isolated metaphorical processing deficit. I mean, of course, another possibility is that there are a number of reasons you could perform poorly on that metaphor processing task. And a bit of support for that is that the lesion data don't map on all that well to your tuning and learning study that you did in the scanner, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So you're absolutely right. So one could imagine ways, or let me step back. So at this stage, mostly our agenda, and you can think of this as a first pass, right? And the first pass is to say, can we come up with stimuli where we can feel confident about testing at least that piece of things? And can we show that, a very clinical question, can we show that there are people who have selective problems with this kind of comprehension, which may have implications for their real-world lives in a way that we've never really been sensitive to, right? So that's the main thing. Now, but you're asking a psychology, cognitive neuroscience question is what's the mechanism, right? There are probably multiple ways that one could arrive at this. And it could be, there might be certain aspects of working memory that's important. There might be, executive function is such a loose set of things, but there might be something there. It might be that in novel metaphors, there's underlying that as a kind of analogical processing. There's an analogical reasoning that might be important, and that might be really what's part of what's going on in some people. So it might be the case that you can arrive at this sort of deficit in different ways. And so right now what we're doing is we're going prospectively in people both with Parkinson's and mild cognitive impairment, where we're looking at those other things as well to start to map out is when people have selective deficits, do those actually correlate with any of these other, again, it's going to be correlational, not causal, but at least as mapping out what are the domains in which people have deficits when they have relatively selective metaphor deficits.
Thank you. It was a really great talk, and it gave me a lot of ideas. So I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to say one and ask you one. And the one I wanted to say was in response to the very good question about the schemas, did they depict an action ideationally, or did they actually have an action in them? In a way, what's beautiful about the schemas, and of course we can worry about any of our signals or our stimuli, but what's beautiful about them is just like a word, which is higher up in the abstraction chain that you drew, it's a single experience, if you will. And so the schema pushing is a single thing, like push is a single thing. So this is just respects for that simplicity rather than the getting closer to the real and doing the video. So I think there's something that we can answer just using exactly the kinds of stimuli that you've looked at. So that was my observation to that question. But my question is this, I love the first series of studies where there's word, schema, and picture, and how performance on each balances out for people who are differentially impaired, let's say. But what's so interesting is that all three of them are representations of the world. And you ask the developmentalists among us to think. So I've always followed directions, and so I started to think. And in the developmental literature, there's a very striking finding about young children. It's Judy Deloche's work. The kids have trouble using a representation as a stand for. That is, they understand a picture, right? but they have trouble seeing on a picture. If you say, like, I'm going to hide a little dog in a real room, and here's a picture of a real room. They have trouble going from where you show it on the picture to go into the real room and search in that place. And it's a very tight developmental function, but under 2, they have trouble with that. And so that raises for me the question of your 3, all of them representations, is there any evidence about how informative they are with regard to interacting with the actual world?
So, I mean, a picture is already an abstract representation,
Exactly
right? To
right.
start with, right?
That's right.
And maybe when we have better VR technologies, we'll get closer, a representation that might be a little closer to how people interact with the world. But there's no question that a rich image is still a representation, right? And so, so within the limits of most of our paradigms, you know, because we don't take people out in the world, and you know, I mean, maybe with patients we could do that to some extent, but in the scanner certainly you can't do that. I mean, I think for at least in adults, our assumption is that unless people have had any kind of developmental abnormality, if they've otherwise been healthy until their neurologic damage, at some point they have known how to read simple pictures, right? So that's our starting point. But I think your point is well taken. We've done work with videos that maybe, you know, because a static image of an action is still more abstract than a video of an action, right? And we've done some work also looking at gestures, and it turns out that if you use videos, people are more likely to gesture than if you're using static images.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Just a short question. I was wondering, what is the role of iconicity in this? Because schema is more abstract than image, but more and less abstract than word, but significantly more iconic than words. Yes. And so what's the interaction between iconicity and the continuum between concrete and abstract? And
let me make sure I understand, because it sounds to me like you might be using iconicity in a technical way that I don't necessarily know. Right? Because if you said I want to call your schemas icons, I'd say sure, that's fine. So there must be some specific way in which you're using the word icon that I'm not sensitive to.
By iconicity I mean the property to depict the external world. I mean the representation of, also schematic representation of a man versus a woman is still more iconic than the word man versus woman. On the other hand, we know that there are different degrees of iconicity in language besides the metaphorical use of language. So for instance, to run is a pure symbol. I mean, it's a symbol word. Vice versa, runner is more iconic because you can analyze the word and identify to run, which is a symbol, and ER, which is a suffix, so you have a diagram, a sort of diagram. But besides this, I was wondering whether there is an interaction.
So let me just answer that question, because I think the way we're using schemas is very close to a visual icon, and it's a methodologic issue, because we norm these images for high degrees of agreement, right? Because we want to know when people are looking at them in a scanner that we generally think people are reacting to them in the same way. And so in our norming phase, the only schemas we use I think would fit your notion of icon, because there's large agreement that that is what is being depicted.
Yeah.
So I really loved the talk, and I think that you've identified a really important level of representation to study, but I'm not convinced it's one, right? I mean, it seems like there's 1,000 things going on here. So let me just give you 2 examples of. So it seems like the schemas, so Darwin's representation there, That's very akin to a metaphor, right? There's nothing like your schematic representation of pushing, or your schematic representation of above, right? Which is probably, what you're doing is capturing the spatial relationship in a way that, as you say, throws away irrelevant information. Here, you're capturing a spatial relationship that involves a structure mapping, right? And that's why it helps organizing thought. That's a totally different process. And there's no reason to think that there's something in common between the two, except for that the sense of iconicity, where some aspect of the spatial relations that are being depicted can be read off the symbol itself, right? So the notion of icon is that parts of what's being represented are captured in parts of the representation that preserves the spatial relations between the two. So I guess the question is, and in some cases, it's going to turn out that there's an alphabet of that. In other cases, it's not. Like there's a schema for a face that's innate. That just means that there's an innate representation of two eyes above a nose, above a mouth, which is interpreted by the baby. It can lead to imitation, it can lead to gaze following. I mean, it has the computational role of a face representation. It's schematic in the sense that it's spatial and allows you to identify a face. There's no innate alphabet there. It's just an innate schema. So I guess the question is there one natural kind here, or are there many? What do you think?
So clearly I don't know the answer, right? So let's be clear about that. Having said that, I'm going to try to answer it as though I know the answer. So, I mean, my intuition, let's go back to right? And so my intuition is that one can read narrative, beautiful narrative, like a Nabokov short story, right? And there's rich stuff there, but it's still made up of sentences, words, and alphabets, and one can study at that level, and the mapping from that to a Nabokov short story might be enormously complex, but the question you raise is exactly what makes this interesting to me, is it the case that these are elements that are then concatenated in different ways? It doesn't necessarily have to be that, right? But it might be the case that when Edison is thinking of these ducks, right? So he's drawing these schematic forms and sort of how they're related. And I suspect if one had a rich data set of people doing these kinds of doodles, that even the spatial location in which things are put on a sheet of paper might have some relevance to how people are organizing their thinking.
It's not from the picture that necessarily that compositional structure comes. It's preserving the actual relations, the causal relations, the object relations.
So I want to make sure it feels important that I understand the force of your argument here. So I might say that pieces of this at least resemble the kind of iconicity that we've been looking at in these very pared down ways, and that there might be a syntax of those, and you're saying the syntax doesn't necessarily fall out from these individual elements, that there might have some other structure to it.
Sometimes it will, and sometimes I just am doubting that there's one.
No, I have, right.
I'm gonna just, we're running over time, and
Okay.
Alex has been very patient, so I'm gonna just cut that off, if you don't mind, and let Alex ask.
So I just wanted to get you to clarify. I mean, there seems to be confusion, it might just be my confusion, between the format of the stimuli and the conceptual representation. I mean, for a lot of us, when we talk about concepts, the idea embedded in that definition is that it transcends the physical format. And a lot of, at least to my mind, the neural imaging findings seem to support that. So you can have, you know, the concept of a dog from looking at a real dog, or a movie of a dog, picture of a dog, a schematic of a dog, the hearing a bark, or the written word, right? So that the form, I mean, that's the whole point, that you transcend format. Now, you know, for example, that if you map out a system that's responsive to biological motion, and you define it in the brain, and then you have people read about biological motion versus text that doesn't involve biological motion, you'll get those same areas involved. One in your, you know, one you might, in the kind of hierarchy you were developing, say one is more concrete and the other more abstract. I'm not even sure that's the case, right? I mean, point light walkers are pretty damn abstract. Mm-hmm. But the point I'm trying to make is that the stimulus format really seems not to be critical. The other example is the Heider and Simmel kind of stimuli. We've made vignettes where you get really kind of high-level social concepts like sharing and so on. The only thing on the screen are those circles moving around. But if it's a social interpretation, you'll get areas like the fusiform face area, right? I just want to, one last point, that it's not necessarily the argument that what's going on in the fusiform face area is somehow concrete. It could be just as abstract, right? But it's defined by just looking at a face. And it seems to me that, you know, the brain would take advantage of these systems that have already been developed to aid in kind of higher order thinking that goes on when people interpret, you know, squares and circles moving on a screen as a social situation.
So I don't disagree, and this goes back to maybe the conversation at the end of Ura's talk, which is, what's the nature of generalization, right? And if one wants to say, and some of our experiments were designed accordingly, right? Which is it the case that whether there's a word or a picture or a schema for actions, are there some areas that are commonly responsive across formats, right? So that kind of question is what we're interested in. But I don't think it follows that it is a given that there are not other parts of the brain that are specially tuned to these intermediate representations. Right? And that's all I'm trying to say, which is that it's a question, and what I'd like to suggest between imaging and our patient work, it suggests that there are some parts of the brain that are tuned specifically to these intermediate representations where there's some degree of generalization, but not the full generalization that you're talking about.
Okay, so then let me just give you one scenario and you give me the prediction.
Make it a short scenario.
Let's say we do look at metaphor, but all within different domains. So food, for example, there's a lot of food metaphors, right? And then we have some other domain of metaphor. So from what you're saying, you know, my prediction would be that you can map out areas of the brain that cover lots of places for food, right? Orbital frontal cortex, frontal areas, insula, right? That those would be involved in that domain and not in the other domain. Whereas, if I'm understanding you correctly, you would also insist that there would be some other region that would be involved in any metaphor. So that it would generalize across domain.
Yeah. So I think we've actually done that study. We just haven't analyzed it. And so we have collected the data, right? And the study is, so I made the point that we have these nominal metaphors in which the vehicle is either conveyed through auditory information or visual information, right? And what we've done is we've functionally identified the relevant auditory and visual areas, and the prediction is that in some areas, like the inferior frontal gyrus is a good candidate, that would be generalized across both of them, but auditory cortex and visual motion, for example, might have differential neural activity for those kinds of metaphors, right? So it's a kind of conquer and divide, like what's similar, what's different strategy.
I have the task of telling the 5 people who were waiting to ask questions that we're out of time, but the more pleasant task of thanking Anjon, but also all of the speakers today. The meeting's off to a terrific start as usual. Thank you guys very much. See you tomorrow at 9. Yeah.
Actually, I have a lot of work that's relevant to this.
Oh, great.